Hello, and welcome to What Moves Us, the podcast where we ask what moves us, or more accurately, what's going to move us in future.
With the Rail Innovation Group's Johannah Randall and Liam Henderson, we look at debates, themes, and decisions of the minute that will impact on the way we get about in the future. Hi, Liam.
Hi, Johannah. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Are you feeling spectacular on the day before Halloween?
Oh, absolutely. And I have a special treat tomorrow because we're going to Enchanted Forest in Pitlochry, which is the annual light show.
Do you get there by public transport?
You have to go by public transport because as part of your ticket, they lay on buses.
This pleases me.
It's very good. I think it's because there's no parking there, so it's much easier to go by bus.
As much as our guests, as much as our audience love to hear from us, we do have a special guest on the line joining us today. So I'm going to let her introduce herself, but handing over to you, Natasha.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Natasha Marsay. I'm the Accessibility and Inclusion Strategy and Policy Lead at Network Rail, which is the world's longest job title, I think. But I work in the system operator team within Network Rail, so centrally, not in a route or region. And I look after all of the customer experience side of accessibility. So in my opinion, the fun side. So everything to do with customer in our managed stations, passenger assistance, mystery shopping, and then the relationships with our regulator as well, so the ORR and the DFT.
I just picking up on one thing. I know we have loads of questions. I'm going to jump in with something else, which is you mentioned it's the customer experience side of accessibility. What would the other side?
Yes. Built environment. So all about sort of the building of stations, bridges, anything like that. So thinking more about sort of impact assessment of what we build and our infrastructure.
Cool. All right. Thank you.
And then I guess there's the website of accessibility as well, but that sort of rolls into my job. So how accessible our website is and our communications and things like that, that all sort of falls into my area as well. But if you were splitting accessibility out, that would be another side of it.
So that's quite interesting, sort of like Liam bringing up that differentiation, the fact that, you know, it's split between your role saying that it's all to do with everything to do with the customer and the separation with the built environment, because whenever we think of accessibility, or it's the way it's directed, is that we always think about the changes required to the infrastructure in order to make stations and the railway more accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's such a huge area, you know, not one person could do it all. So my colleague Lorna does all of the built environment side of accessibility, and she's got an engineering background and is definitely super smart with all of that. I would admit it probably goes over my head a little bit, but some of the intricacies of it all, she's amazing at just being able to quote an exact policy and things, which blows my mind. But there's so much customer experience side which makes accessibility, you know, sort of flow, and you know, we can have really accessible stations, but then if our staff aren't trained to support people or use the right language or how to deliver passenger assistance properly, or, you know, if, for example, the built environment would build an accessible toilet, for example, but then a customer experience angle would say, okay, but how do we make that stoma friendly? So for people who are stoma users, so yes, the room is big enough for a wheelchair user, but do we have the right amount of shelves, or do we have a long enough mirror to help stoma users, or two hooks and things like that? So it's the sort of softer side of accessibility, really, the things that make the experiences not just accessible, but inclusive.
So that is also really interesting, you know, sort of like, you know, honing in on some of the detail on that, because we do think of when we think of accessibility, we are always thinking of, you know, people that are in wheelchairs or who have mobility problems. and that, and actually the issues of accessibility are quite wide. So what sort of what do you see, you know, within that realm of everything, particularly, you know, sort of, you know, what are the big challenges in terms of being able to meet all of those different, you know, accessible needs?
I think that's so difficult because, you know, you can do one thing that makes things easier for somebody, which in turn makes things more difficult for somebody else. So I don't think the perfect station actually exists. You know, if we think about tactile paving, it's so vital for blind and partially sighted people to stay safe, especially around platform edges. But then some wheelchair users might say, actually, it's really uncomfortable to be over tactile paving. You know, I have joint problems, or there's lots of other reasons why people would find that really uncomfortable. And it's having to balance that experience with safety and lots of other things to make sure you get the sort of right blend. And I think it is difficult because the sort of universal sign for accessible is a wheelchair. And people just automatically think, oh, we need to make things accessible for wheelchair users. But there's so many disabilities that aren't even visible disabilities. We think about dyslexia or people with neurodiverse conditions, who would struggle to navigate or to perceive a train station in the way that other people might. But that's not what people think about when they think about disability and accessibility. And so my job is to try and balance all of the needs of everybody and try and at least satisfy some.
So would you say that you have to would you say that the getting by stuff is more difficult when it isn't the visual disabilities? Like, do you have to convince people to spend efforts on different types of disabilities?
Probably, only because if you think about physical accessibility, you've got things like PRM, so person with reduced mobility. There's legislation in place which shapes what our buildings and spaces and places should be like. So, you know, doors should be a certain width and information should be at certain heights so that people in wheelchair users or people of shorter stature can access them. So all of that stuff is sort of baked into the design. And although, you know, as accessibility professionals, we have to keep hammering that home. You have to do all of these things. You have to make this accessible. You know, people have to do that because that's what's commanded of them. Whereas when we start to think about other disabilities, it's potentially easier to mitigate against that. You know, if we think about wayfinding, you know, signage at station isn't accessible for blind people, mitigation, well, we do passenger assistance, so that's fine. And it's not, because not everybody wants to get passenger assistance, not everybody needs to do that. So we need to think about other ways of helping people navigate the space if they can't navigate with the signage that's provided. And that does take more convincing. And I think that's a shame because, you know, everything I do, people want to know what's the cost benefit, you know, what are we getting back? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a cost benefit to make it the right thing to do. It can be an experiential benefit, or it can be, you know, somebody's dignity or pride or confidence that we've improved by doing changes at stations. So yeah, it's a challenge, and it's certainly one that at the minute I feel like I'm winning. So, you know, long may it continue.
So I think that's interesting that you mentioned cost, because particularly at the moment, like these are quite cost constrained times with, you know, the price of everything going up, but also the challenge of getting people back onto rail. And I think you know, that is interesting because whilst, you know, numbers have recovered, that the travel patterns have changed, but because travel patterns have changed, that has impacted on revenue despite the numbers. So how do you make that argument, you know, and it's not really the accessibility argument, I think, because I think, you know, that is probably a way that we've been changing, is it's about making services inclusive. So how do you go about winning that argument, not just sort of like, you know, within Network Rail, but also with, you know, other stakeholders, you know, like train operators and that?
I think the purple pound is really interesting. So the purple pound is essentially how they work out the spending power of the households of people with disabilities. And there's lots of information around, you know, how much do disabled people spend in transport and how much could they spend in transport if it was accessible. And there's lots of different other statistics around, you know, how many disabled people abandon retail opportunities because it's not accessible, or how many people don't travel on public transport for a year after they've had a poor experience. So all of them elements sort of go into making your argument, I guess, and your case for why we should do that and why we should support people. Plus, I mean, there's nearly 15 million disabled people in this country, which makes up a massive chunk of the proportion of the country. So actually, you know, if we don't make things accessible, we're starting to ostracize a really big chunk of people whose money is just as good as their non-disabled counterparts. So, you know, when we put in a CIS screen, for example, we never once question, oh, well, is that the right thing to do? Is that what we should be spending money on? Well, no, because that's, you know, that's how we give customers information. That's what they need to be able to travel. So that's a good spend. But not all customers can interact with that. So there needs to be other things that we put into stations and other opportunities and avenues that we go down for customer information, which do also cost money, but then reach out to those customers who can't interact with a CIS, for example. So, you know, it's making that balance and that case in need. And I think the way that how funding rail has changed since the pandemic, so he talks about train operators, and now we have business plans and business plan commitments, which is sort of a yearly rolling sort of way of asking for money and saying what you're going to deliver, actually probably works a lot better for accessibility, because it gives you a lot more opportunities to be more responsive to what customers need, to what traveling habits look like. You know, when you were doing 5-year plans, it's very difficult to sort of assume what people would want in 5 years' time and make sure you've got the money for it or the ability to deliver that. Whereas now you can be more responsive to how things look, or, you know, what technology is new. We're in an environment where technology is so rapidly improving and improving opportunities for disabled people as well. So, you know, putting companies in the position where they can apply for that funding, or they can pivot into something else, or they can work with other train operators to make a more seamless experience is only a positive, really.
So it's meant steering the conversation onto the use of technology, and just thinking about, you know, some of the, you know, the early announcements of the government this year, and I don't really want to really explore sort of like the closure of ticket offices that have been proposed, but more from an accessible point of view, because a lot of people fed into the consultation on the basis that people with disabilities use ticket offices more. So there's that kind of angle of it, you know, in sort of like, you know, the human interaction that maybe disabled people or people with mobility needs need a bit more of that support. But also the opposite to that is also, you know, how are people with additional mobility needs or disability needs, you know, accessing technology and using technology in order to aid their journeys?
So there's sort of two elements to that. So data from before the pandemic said that 40% of disabled people were digitally excluded, so didn't have access to the internet, or the internet wasn't accessible for them in the way that they needed it to be. I would argue that the pandemic has probably accelerated people's digital abilities because of need, and people being more isolated at home and having to use the internet or digital offerings to support them. So I wouldn't expect that that number is as high now, but there isn't solid data to sort of support that thought process. But there's so many things that people, use to support their travelling habits. So at some of our stations, and it will be all of our managed stations by the end of the financial year, we've got Good Maps, which is an indoor wayfinding technology, which was originally designed for blind and partially sighted people to help them navigate around the station using LiDAR maps, so they wouldn't necessarily need to get passenger assistance. And that's had sort of other multi-benefits, so around alternatives, so non-English speaking customers can use multi-language support on there. It has step-free access for wheelchair users or for people with lots of luggage or prams, to be able to navigate around the station, especially if they can't use the signage that's provided at stations. We actually did a film for this a few weeks ago, and one of the people who was in the film had brought his wife along, and she said, "Oh, I'm actually terribly dyslexic and I don't come to stations because I can't read the signs, and I didn't realise that there was things like this that could help me, and I'd never thought about it from a perspective of people with dyslexia, so it was just another use case." There's, even apps for what platform your train's going on, or station information, or being able to buy tickets online opens up this sort of world to people digitally that may have struggled to use a TVM, for example, or may have not been able to read a timetable when they were very small, or CIS screens are too high up. So there's loads of different technology out there that people can utilise to help them travel independently. Do I think that takes away from, that human interaction? No, I think it's still really vital that people have people that they can ask. We can put up as much signage as we want at stations. I'm sure anyone who works operationally will say they get asked 10 times a day, "Hi, where's the way out? How do I get out?" People just like to be able to speak to people or to interact, or they have more trust in what people tell them than what digital products tell them. So I think there's always a need for people, but there's lots of things that we can do technology-wise to help give people a bit more confidence as well.
Natasha, you mentioned the Good Map system, which I have used. I have done a trial for Euston, which was very helpful. But then you went to list off a lot of other solutions that might be out there for people. But is there sort of do you now need a guide to know which system you need when you go to which journey to which support there?
That's so funny, because what we preach all the time is consistency. We need to give customers a consistent experience on how to use stations. You shouldn't have to download 10 apps to be able to get across the country, because that's just not viable. And like you say, is there a glossary that tells me what I need at what station? It's an unsurmountable ask. So what I'm really sort of consistent about asking for is, can we have the same systems everywhere? And that's why Network Rail have pledged to have Good Maps at all of our managed stations. I know Transpennine Express have got Good Maps at all of their managed stations now. Avanti are doing 5 of their stations this year and finishing them off next year as well. So, I know ScotRail were starting to look at Good Maps, and other operators as well. And, it's hard because, there's lots of suppliers out there who do similar things. And it is, as an industry, we have to test all of them things and come up with parameters of what we would expect, a product to be able to deliver. So when we think about Good Maps, we want something that's free at the point of access for customers. We want something that doesn't put in hardware at stations, because we have a lot of historical stations that are listed that you can't start, drilling and putting beacons and signs up and things. And we wanted something that people could use in their day-to-day life as well, and have that first and final mile sort of support with as well. So, we tested lots of different systems. Network Rail did, other operators did as well, and it's coming to that consensus as an industry and saying this is the right thing for us, this ticks the boxes that we need it to tick, and this supports customers as well, and getting all that customer feedback together and going with a supplier. And I'm sure you'll have heard from many of the people who've been on this podcast that rail is not a fast-moving beast. Everything takes its sweet time. So this has been something I've worked on since 2020, and now we're nearly in 2024. And we're starting to get there. We're starting to get the adoption. It's the same with British Sign Language. You might have seen the BSL totems at stations, and Network Rail are pledging to have them at all their managed stations as well. And I know other operators, so Chiltern, Southwestern, TransPennine Express, I know LNER are doing things with BSL. And it's so important to have that information out there. There's nearly 90,000 people who rely on BSL to help them travel. And when we were talking earlier about revenue and how do we get more disabled people into travel again, them 90,000 people have now got something out there, the confidence to be able to get them to travel. And we did something at Birmingham New Street a few months ago with the Dudley Deaf Children's Society, and a mother came along to that and she said, oh, I can finally, feel confident letting my kids travel, because before I thought they'd be stranded, or I didn't think they'd be able to get on the right train, or no one would be able to communicate with them, and now they can. And that's selfishly, that's the lovely thing about this job, that you can walk around a station and you can see people use things that you put in and give them the confidence to travel. And it's quite a selfish buzz, I guess.
I'm very passionate. Is there any solutions that aren't out there that you'd like to see invented?
Oh, I was having this conversation earlier, actually. There's so many things out there like Innovate UK and different innovation zone competitions. And, but we get, I was reviewing the second year people who've applied for the Bristol Innovation Zone that we do the other day. And there's some amazing applicants. But to me, I'd love to see somebody come up with something to support level boarding, whether that's some kind of ramp that can deploy from a train or what, I don't know. I'm not a visionary, but I'd love to see somebody come up with something, really intuitive that would speed along the level boarding conversation, because that would be truly game changing. I'd love to see that.
I laughed at that one, not because it's funny, but because I live on the Highland Main Line in Scotland, and some of the platforms, between the platform and the train, the interface is about a foot. So even if you're able-bodied, you struggle to get on the train. And I'm sorry, I am going to name check one of the stations on the line, because it is quite amusing sometimes to watch this. But Dunkeld have come up with it's an unmanned station all the time, and they've come up with a very simple solution which would work if you had all the same rolling stock traveling all the time. But every time a train pulls up, you have to move these. They have these little mobile steps that are on wheels that you have to move along to the train carriage in order to get onto the train.
That's incredible.
As I say, it'd be okay if the train stopped at the same place, or it was the same train every time. I mean, like, it does work and it's a cheap solution, but it's not really what you want in the 21st century. And of course, whilst it works for able-bodied people, it still does not work for disabled people.
No.
And
that's the problem. There's too many different types of rolling stock, and there's just such a wide variety of different platforms. We've got a Victorian infrastructure, which doesn't lend itself to being maybe the most accessible. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge. And I know there's some super smart people working on how do we think about that, and how do we start to move towards a level boarding world. But yeah, I'd love to see somebody come up with something really cool.
Because I think, on that solution as well is that, and it often comes up in conversations with in innovation circles, not just in within rail innovation group members, is just some of the barriers as well to being
Mm,
able to come up with solutions, because I think, because obviously the platform train interface, not only, is it an issue for accessibility, but also it's one of the biggest causes of accidents as well,
mm,
boarding and alighting from trains. That so it's also partial to stringent regulations in how you do
mm,
that. So it'd be interesting to explore sort of like some of how particularly for our members and SMEs is what they can do to sort of not only to make their products more accessible and inclusive, but also how they can help themselves by applying standards and things like that. Particularly if we've got people listening to this who are thinking, actually, I could probably come up with a solution to that challenge.
mm. Yeah, I think we probably need to be maybe a bit more transparent as an industry, if not just what our problems are, but what's the lay of the land look like. Like I say, I was looking at the Bristol innovation stuff the other day, and it's only when you look at people's applications where you think, oh, if we'd have told you this, you'd have probably done this differently. And actually, what information do we need to share when we put these challenges out there to really shape the responses that we get? So it is definitely a good challenge and something that we need to think more about as an industry.
Do you think that as if we're setting that challenge, do you think because I think it's interesting you're reflecting back on if you'd have given somebody more information, and do you think you understand what information you need to give people to that challenge? And equally, do you think particularly if you don't work within rail, do you think even SMEs and startups that are thinking about, oh yeah, I've got a solution that I think I could apply, do you think they even understand that it has to be different when applying it to the rail?
Probably not. Probably not to the extent that we would want. It's hard because it's only when you look back, like I was saying, and you think, oh, that was so silly. Why didn't we tell people X? But you don't know what you don't know, do you? And it's only through that learning and disseminating information. It's really important that, we've done this innovation zone at Bristol, but there's other people who might do innovation zones, and sharing that learning and saying, oh, tell them about this, or tell them why we can't do this, or that we've already tried this and this didn't work, but it could work if we did this. So it's working together as an industry more, and working more with people who run these competitions as well, and starting to share information with them, or shape our ask more. Sometimes we put out such a broad stroke asks, and if we just tailored that a bit more, then maybe you wouldn't get such a plethora of different things. You'd get more things that are really bespoke to what you need. But it must be really difficult as a supplier. I do empathize with them, because it is such a strange industry, rail, I guess. We have so many different legislations and needs and safety concerns, and there's so much red tape that it must be very daunting as a supplier to think, gosh, I really want, I've got this product and I'd love to see that at a station. And you need people, there's a great guy called Brian who manages the Bristol one that I work on. And you need people like that who are just really clued up and really great with talking to SMEs and sort of supporting them through that process.
Natasha, can I ask you a question? It's a bit of a leading, teasing question. Have you ever been told you can't do something because of health and safety?
Yeah, of course.
Wondering about the random
Yeah.
barriers you come up against when actually trying to do the logical thing of help with accessibility.
There's such a balance that you have to make, because there's things that you would do for the safety of disabled people, for example, that that you're not allowed to do, or that would be, frowned upon, or you can't do this because of this. There's so many little, loopholes that come around that say we can't do this because we do this because, and it's quite hard to say. Are we here to listen to customers or to just assume what they need? And I think it's quite hard to get that balance right.
Yeah, and it's really hard balancing against those different needs, isn't it? Because how do you balance that against what you were saying earlier, Natasha, about, consistency across the station estate, isn't it? So
Exactly.
you know what to expect at every single station, that you visit to, regardless of whatever your need is, that it all, it all works the same, it all acts the same, but then they don't, do they? And we kind of expect our passengers or our customers to be experts in navigating their way around the railway system. Because on Monday I'm at this station, so of course it must operate this way, but then on Tuesday I'm at a different station, so it's got a different rule, and that's we've already touched upon rules, but there are different rules everywhere according to which route you're on, which type of station you're on, whether somebody's done something or not done something.
We're coming to the end of our interview, so I wanted to slip in a question which we ask all of our guests. You can pick how you want to answer this, but it's a general question, which is, what advice do you have for either young people or new people to the sector?
Join. It's great. It's such a lovely industry, and you know what, every day is a school day in rail. You learn something new. When you talk to people who've been here 40 or 50 years, it's got to be quite good, or people wouldn't stay that long, would they? It's there's some really smart people who really do want you to succeed, and there's so many different areas. I'm not a train girl. When I first started at TransPennine Express, you used to fill in this like questionnaire so members of staff could get to know you, and one of the questions was, what's your favorite train station? And I imagine most people write ones that have wonderful architectural elements or X, Y, and Z, and I just put, I don't really mind one with a Pret. It was never something that I was, really into trains or really into stations or anything. I just liked accessibility and stumbled into an industry that's great. So I'm super grateful, and I think whether you're working in law or accounting, or whether you like social media or marketing, there's all of them different roles within rail. So don't strike it off as, it's just something that people who love trains work in, and everyone's obsessed with their favorite type of train, which I do actually have now. So there you go, I'm adopted in. But I think it's such a wonderful industry, and everyone moves around, and it is Network Rail has 44,000 people, but it doesn't feel like that at all. Everyone's related to somebody or the wife of somebody, and it's very sort of like a family, really.
Brilliant. Well, you are very passionate, and that is a wonderful message to end with. And I'm going to be looking out for these yellow lines all over the place on platforms now.
Enjoy.
Thank you very much for your time, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of What Moves Us. We hope we moved you. For more episodes, you'll definitely want to subscribe to our channel.
Till next time.